You may have heard about reservations in Azure, but have you heard about reservations? Well, to be fair, they do have slightly different names. When talking about reservations in Azure, you usually mean the product where you go, hey, I know I'm going to be using X amount of resources in Azure for the next 1 or 3 years. Give me some discounts. But the new thing here, and what I wanted to talk about today, is capacity reservations. And that is not such a new service, but it's still in preview. I believe it went into public preview in March of 2021. In short, capacity reservations means that Microsoft reserves capacity in their data centers for you, which you may or may not know is not the case with reservations. So, when should you be using capacity reservations? When should you not be using them? How does it compare to reservations? Or can you combine them? Well, let's take a look, shall we? If there's topics around Azure you want me to cover, leave a comment down below and like and subscribe while you're there. Now, like I said, the short story about capacity reservations is that with them, Microsoft reserves capacity in their data centers for you, or to be more precise, your VMs. And it's easy to think that with reservations or reserved instances, you are guaranteed to be able to fire up the amount of VMs that you have reservations for, but that is not the case. Imagine a scenario where the Azure data centers are under such a heavy load that there's just not enough resources for everyone. This could be because of a region going down due to a natural disaster, or, just heavy load because suddenly the whole world works from home due to a pandemic. So, how does Microsoft prioritize who gets compute resources in such a case? Well, the first thing that happens is that any running spot VMs will be kicked out. Those are the lowest ones on the priority list, but any other running VM will not be impacted. If you would try to fire up any currently deallocated VMs in such a case, then this is the prioritized list in a simplified manner. The lowest on our list is the spot VMs. Those are the lowest priority ones. Then you have the regular old VMs, and over that you have the VMs that are covered by reserved instances. They are prioritized over regular VMs, but they are not guaranteed resources. On top of this priority list is any VMs covered by capacity reservations. They will always have the necessary resources in order to fire up. So that's basically the why part of a capacity reservation. In a situation where Microsoft does not have enough resources for everyone, then you are guaranteed the resources you have reserved. When this feature becomes generally available, Microsoft is also promising a SLA on it. But of course, Microsoft does not provide this for free. It does come with a cost. So let's move on to taking a look at the cost part, shall we? The pricing here is actually surprisingly easy. The cost for a capacity reservation is the same amount that you would pay for the compute part of a same type of VM. Key here is compute part. Say you have a simple Windows-based D2 VM with just the default disks and everything. A capacity reservation for that VM would cost the same that it would cost to just to have it running, minus everything that's not compute, for example, Windows license, storage transactions. And one thing to note though is that capacity reservations will cost you money even if it's not currently being used. The billing starts from the moment you deploy it, no matter if you have a VM running in that capacity reservation or not. The good thing is that any reserved instances that you have that matches the capacity reservation will be applied to it. So if you have a reserved instance for the aforementioned D2 VM and there's still enough room in it, then that reserved instance will be applied to your capacity reservation. Another nice thing with capacity reservations in regards to costs, that differs it from reserved instances is the commitment part. With reserved instances, you commit to a period of 1 or 3 years, and in some cases you can go up to 5 years. But with capacity reservations, there's no commitments. You can cancel it at any time. So that's the cost part of things. Now, how does it all work? Well, unlike reserved instances, with capacity reservations, you need to select a specific VM size, as specific as down to the version of that VM size. Of course, you also need to select a region, and you can even specify the availability set if you so choose. Once you have deployed your capacity reservation, the resources to fire up a VM of that size is reserved for you and the billing starts. That means that in the region you selected, in the optionally selected availability set, there's a resources reserved for that specific VM size. Keep in mind though that in order to use your capacity reservation, you have to set it as a property on the VM you want to use it for. It does not automatically apply like reserved instances does, and that is a good thing, but because that means that you can target specific VMs that you want to use the capacity reservation for. You do not want to end up in a situation where some test server is taking up the capacity reservation when in reality you need that reservation for a business critical server or something like that. Also, when you create a capacity reservation, it will also count towards any quotas on your subscriptions, meaning that if you have maxed out your quotas, you will need to request an increase. In that matter, capacity reservations works pretty much the same way as a VM does, meaning that one VM or capacity reservation can count towards a number of different quotas. For example, numbers of VMs of a size, number of VMs in a family, total cores in a region, and so on. As for the question of why you should not be using capacity reservations, well, the cheeky answer is that you probably will never need it. But then again, that's true for a lot of things, so let's get a little more serious here. There are some limitations with capacity reservations that you need to keep in mind. I mentioned earlier that capacity reservations will count towards the quotas on your subscriptions, and that is one thing you need to account for. Capacity reservations will also not work with proximity placement groups, update domains, ultra SSDs, or availability sets. It also is only available for certain VM families, including the A version 2, B, D, E, and F, meaning, for example, there's no support for GPU VMs. You might also not be so shocked to know that capacity reservations will not be supported for spot VMs or for any free subscriptions like the free trial or Azure for Students, subscriptions like that. So when should you be using capacity reservations? I do have two use cases for you. Maybe you can figure out a couple of your own too. The first one is a disaster recovery scenario. A lot of companies have disaster plans that include spinning up VMs in another region if one region were to fail, if there's a regional outage in Azure. But that's just the thing. A lot of companies have the exact same plan. That means that, for example, if the North Europe region goes completely down, there will be a huge influx in VMs being powered on in West Europe. Most likely there will not be enough resources for this in West Europe. With capacity reservations in your DR site, you can be sure that the resources you need in a disaster recovery scenario will be there, and you could also use you can always use the capacity reservations for other things when everything is running fine. The other scenario is if you're planning a huge deployment on a specific date and you don't want it to fail because of lack of resources in the Azure region. Well, in this type of scenario, you can just deploy capacity reservations well before the deployment, and once the deployment is done, you can safely delete those capacity reservations because there's no commitment period. So to sum it all up, capacity reservations actually reserve the resources for EVMs, unlike reserved instances that only provides you with priority. Use capacity reservations when you need to be absolutely sure that the resources you need will be there for you when you need it. You will be billed for a capacity reservation from the moment you deploy it up until the moment you delete it. However, this is only the compute part and not for any Windows licenses and stuff like that. Any VMs that should utilize your capacity reservations needs to be configured to do so, and you can combine capacity reservations with reserved instances to have your compute discounts applied to the capacity reservations. Like this video and subscribe if you found it helpful, and yeah, see ya.